Hi, everybody. I'm Harlan Crow, and I got up to the podium to make a few remarks, but I had to find my wife because I have to sit by her. But it looks like anyway. Sorry about that. Well, welcome to the Old Parkland debate series. We built this debate chamber for events such as this one tonight, and of course, if you're going to have a debate chamber, pretty important that you have debates. We've been doing them now for several years, but we have to partner with somebody that can help us make this work. And National Review Magazine, National Review Institute has been our best partner during these years of putting this on. So I'm incredibly grateful to William S. Buckley, God rest his soul, for creating National Review, to Lindsay Craig for running it so ably today. Tonight, we welcome Stephanie Cates of NRI to introduce the program. We welcome Christopher Wolfe, who will moderate, and our wonderful debaters, Oren Cass and David Bonson. Stephanie, you're on, and Kathy, I can't sit by you, so I'm going to sit by Michael.
Thank you so much, Harlan. On behalf of National Review Institute, it's my honor to welcome all of you. We're delighted to continue this debate series and partner with the wonderful team here at Old Parkland. I want to start off by saying how truly appreciative we are of the great work that Harlan and Kathy have done to honor the American experiment and promote the free exchange of ideas. Sometimes when you're successful, people assume you have other intentions. This is a misguided assumption that corrupts the very foundation of altruistic giving. I know everyone in this room will join me in expressing our sincere gratitude to the Crows for all they have built and all they have given out of love for their community and for their country. As the nonprofit journalistic think tank founded by William F. Buckley Jr., National Review Institute amplifies the mission of National Review by supporting conservative journalism, convening conservatives, and educating our fellow citizens. Earlier this year, the entire NR enterprise began a strategic planning process leading up to 2025, when we will commemorate Bill Buckley's centennial and celebrate his enduring impact on the conservative movement. One outcome of this process has been an updated mission statement, which reclaims and restates our stake in the ground, and it is: National Review defends and advances the ordered liberty that is necessary to human flourishing and to a free, prosperous, and strong America. Free enterprise is one of our core values, and to that end, NRI created National Review Capital Matters, a place for financial and economic news and commentary from a pro-free market perspective. Andrew Studiford is the editor of Capital Matters, and Dominic Pino is our Thomas Rhodes Fellow and a prominent contributor. Both are here with us tonight, and I hope you'll have the chance to talk with them afterwards if you haven't already. This event represents our continuing investment here in Dallas. Last night, 21 mid-career professionals completed our Fall 2023 Burke to Buckley Fellowship with this final session on civic gratitude, led by NRI Senior Fellow Catherine Jean Lopez. This is our 10th year of offering this program in Dallas, and I know we have many alumni here tonight. We also have a number of 1955 Society members joining us, some traveling from other parts of Texas, and even from California. Your philanthropic support allows us to present programs like this, and we thank you for your generosity. In early 2024, we will be back in this chamber for our Dallas Regional Seminar, on February 14th to be exact. Our theme is Foundations of Freedom, the Importance of America's Constitutional Pillars. So we hope you'll join us and show your love for the U.S. Constitution on Valentine's Day. Our activities in Texas also extend beyond Dallas. On November 30th in the Woodlands, we have a program entitled Defining America, Preserving Our National Identity. The speakers include former Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, former Arizona Governor Doug Ducey, former Congressman Kevin Brady, and National Review Editor-in-Chief Rich Lowry. Some of you here tonight are planning to join us for the event, and we do have flyers. You can see our friend Bobby Kasperzak afterwards. Civil discourse and respectful discussion in the tradition of firing line are hallmarks of the Buckley legacy. NRI is honored to preserve that legacy with our debate series, which has covered topics such as foreign policy, ESG investing, and the Second Amendment. As always, we enjoy cocktails afterward to reflect on what we just heard and see if any opinions were changed. Tonight's moderator is Christopher Wolfe. Dr. Wolfe is a distinguished research scholar in the politics department at the University of Dallas. From 1989 to 2021, he was president of the American Public Philosophy Institute, a group of university scholars that promotes a natural law philosophy rooted in the principles of the American founding. APPI is now known as the Dallas Forum for Law, Politics, and Culture, and Dr. Wolfe is president emeritus. He's been a good friend to NRI as a discussion leader for the aforementioned Burke to Buckley program, and two of his daughters are past Burke to Buckley fellows. So I will turn it over now to Dr. Christopher Wolfe.
Thank you very much. Tonight we have a debate forum on the role of government in free enterprise. As was mentioned, this is a civil debate, and I love the delicious irony of sitting here looking across the room at the picture of the assassination of Caesar. I think the fact that it's on that side of the room indicates we're not going to have that on this side of the room. So the topic tonight, resolved. Public policy should play a larger role in economic outcomes. And in recent years, some prominent voices on the right have said that the free market cannot be absolute and that economic policy must serve the general welfare of the nation. And this has invigorated, spirited debates between advocates of the traditional conservative agenda of smaller government, lower taxes, deregulation, and free trade on one hand, and advocates for a new conservative agenda that would restrict trade and immigration, implement industrial and family policy, and regulate finance and technology on the other. We have two outstanding speakers tonight. The speaker for the motion is Oren Cass. He's executive director of American Compass and author of The Once and Future Worker, a vision for the renewal of work in America. He's a contributing opinion writer for the Financial Times, and his work appears in many other outlets as well. From 2005 to 2015, he worked as a management consultant in Bain & Company. Also earned his J.D. magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, but we won't hold that against him, where he was elected vice president and treasurer of the Harvard Law Review and oversaw the journal's budget and operations. While still in law school, he became domestic policy director for Governor Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign. He joined the Manhattan Institute as a senior fellow in 2015 and is a prolific scholar, as well as a speaker on college campuses and elsewhere. He founded American Compass at the start of 2020. On the con side, we have David Bonson, the founder, managing partner, and chief investment officer of the Bahnsen Group, a national private wealth management firm. Prior to launching that, he spent 8 years as managing director at Morgan Stanley and 6 years as a vice president at UBS. He's a frequent guest on TV shows, regular contributor to various outlets, and a regular lecturer as well. He serves on the board of directors for the National Review Institute in New York City and is the author of several best-selling books, including Crisis of Responsibility, The Case for Dividend Growth, and most recently, There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths, which was released in November of 2021. And the format tonight is going to be an opening statement by each person that will last 7 minutes exactly or less, and then a rebuttal of 5 minutes. And after that, I'll throw some questions at them. And then during that time, we're going to be collecting questions from you, from the audience, and we'll present those to the speakers after that. So let me begin then with Oren.
All right. Well, thank you very much for being here. Thank you especially to the Crows. It is an incredible privilege to debate here. I had the chance to do it in 2016, and it left quite an impression. When the invite for this came, it's what we call an instant yes, to have the chance to be here. I thought I would start with something on which I think we agree, though David can correct me if I'm wrong, which is that policymakers have to have some conception of the common good and human flourishing toward which we are trying to advance. Obviously, there will be competing visions to the extent they are compatible. We would like to have a pluralistic society that accommodates more than one. But at the end of the day, it is a core function of our politics to define the common good and to see that public policy advances it. And I think we would probably also agree that for conservatives, there's a fairly clear understanding of what that looks like. It begins with strong families and communities. It entails an economy that's able to generate rising living standards and support our national security. And it envisions a sustainable form, meaning that it allows people to raise a next generation able to do the same. Importantly, that has to happen in the context of limited government. We see markets as both necessary to that form of flourishing and the best way to deliver it. So far, so good, I hope. I think, though, that this presents what I would call the conservatives' quandary. And the conservatives' quandary is that because that is our definition of success, we actually need markets to do a lot. That's very different from the libertarian position. If a libertarian may see freedom as the end unto itself. So long as the market is free, we have achieved our goal. Progressives don't expect the market to accomplish much, and in fact prefer to a significant extent that government play the leading role in delivering on the vision of the common good. But conservatives have a quandary. We need markets to do more. For us, we uniquely place deep and substantive demands on our markets. Yes, we want them to ensure plentiful consumer goods. I like consumption. I don't think we should be living in log cabins, but that's not all we need markets to do. We need them to provide good jobs that will support strong families and communities. We need them to fuel innovation and productivity growth. We need them to expand output. We need them to solve social problems. We need them to spread prosperity widely. We need them to provide for our resilience and national security. And the reason this is a quandary is that markets don't actually do any of those things automatically. There's nothing in economic theory that guarantees they will. They can do those things. They can do them better than any other economic system. But there's no guarantee they will. And I think we were lulled in the second half of the last century by the extent to which they were doing those things into believing that they automatically would. As if by an invisible hand. Yes, the invisible hand, which we remember, according to Adam Smith, quote, "The individual intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention." But how does that work? It's not magic. Smith actually explained it. If you go start a little higher up the page, what he says is upon equal or nearly equal profits, every individual naturally inclines to employ his capital in the manner which is likely to afford the greatest support to domestic industry, and to give revenue and employment to the greatest number of people of his own country. And when those things are the case, Smith notes that even though he intends only his own gain, he also advances the public interest. So Smith was not positing a magical capitalism. He was actually describing something closer to a truism. When we have an alignment between the private and public interest, such that those things that people will pursue for their own interest in the private market are also those things that will advance the common good, then, as if by an invisible hand, capitalism works. So that gives policymakers, I think, a very useful roadmap. It poses two very important questions. Do we have the necessary alignment? And if not, what are the rules, constraints, incentives, institutions, and public action that might bring things into better alignment? And we've seen this cycle occur over and over again through time. We've seen periods where capitalism was working very well. We've seen periods where changes in the world have caused real problems. And the Industrial Revolution initially was not good at all for the working class. It turns out that when child labor becomes a highly attractive and profitable substitute for men's labor, working class families don't flourish. Child labor laws turned out to be a very effective way of addressing that challenge. In the late 19th century, it turned out that building massive trusts to monopolize industries, a very effective way to make a large profit, not conducive to the common good. And we had the antitrust revolution. Obviously, in the context of the Great Depression, we had the New Deal. Over time, we see ways in which these incentives come out of alignment, and it is the role of public policy to bring them back into alignment. I think today we are in one of those periods of non-alignment. Globalization has created enormous opportunities to generate profit not by employing and investing in the domestic market, but by doing so overseas instead. Financialization, which takes operating businesses not to be operating entities that generate profit necessarily by expanding, but financial assets that generate a stream of cash flows and risk-adjusted valuations, has led to enormous opportunities to generate very large profits in ways that have no correlation to maximizing output, increasing employment, or improving productivity. And we see this, I think, in the data for our economy. At American Compass, we define what we call a secure job. Pays $40,000 a year, worker has predictability in hours and future earnings, comes with health benefits and paid time off. Not an ambitious definition. Under that definition, only 40% of the jobs in our economy today are secure, including among those who say they are the primary breadwinner. And so we have markets, we have people making an enormous amount of money, but they are not necessarily doing it in a way that advances the common good. And it must be the role of public policy to ensure that those outcomes are better in the future.
Thanks very much, Oren. Turn to David.
I just want to thank National Review as well as Harlan and Kathy Crow for making tonight's event possible. Of course, I want to thank Oren Cass and American Compass for participating in the discussion of vital importance to our cause and republic. And now, with only 7 minutes, you're going to get my Ben Shapiro speed. I believe many in the room know that the discussion between the so-called new right and so-called traditional conservatives has not always stayed in the bounds of civility and decorum. That's especially true in the cesspool that is our online and social media world. Oren and I have a good track record of maintaining civility and charitable discourse in our exchanges. I have no intention of failing in that tonight, despite what I believe are profound disagreements in often application of principle and in other cases, the principles themselves. My hope after tonight is not that you will find all of these issues fully settled, but that principles will be rediscovered in the role of public policy in economic outcomes, first principles that can help us adjudicate these tough issues. I am here to protest the debate resolution that public policy should play a larger role in economic outcomes, a resolution that Oren supports. I'm hopeful that Oren will avoid any misrepresentation of my view throughout the evening, and he did in his opening comments, but I will make it easy for the audience to understand from the outset. I vehemently deny any attempt to portray my view or the classical conservative view on these issues, rooted in, yes, free market orthodoxy, as denying any role for public policy and economic activity. I'm not an anarchist, nor is any person who I've ever seriously studied or followed in my 40 years of interest in these subjects. I was a very cool kid. We are not debating if there should be any public policy and economic activity, but rather if there should be greater role for public policy. My views are not romantic, utopian, anarchist, or even libertarian, as many people would use that word. Public policy and markets ought to be rooted to a worldview of markets, a worldview of the human person and social cooperation, and a worldview of the relationship between the state and the citizenry. Do the dynamics of trade, finance, and other boogeymen of Oren and his protectionist or nationalist bias in economic policy actually call for more intervention from the disinterested third party we know as the state, or less? I am tempted to assert that public policy in matters of economic activity should be safe, legal, and rare. But that nomenclature has been hijacked by others with a very different agenda, therefore too poisoned in the well to be efficacious. My opposition to tonight's resolution is not rooted in a messianic view of markets, a structure I consider to be nothing more than the forum by which humans act. Markets are filled with people who are subject to poor decision-making, even fraud, greed, and corruption. Markets are wonderful regulators of human behavior, but they are not perfect. But they don't have to be perfect. They only have to be better than the alternatives. On that note, the testimony of history is not subject to debate. Yet even in my defense of markets, I do not see a greater production of goods and services as the sole end we are after. The story is far bigger than that. My objective in economic activity is human flourishing. And applied to public life, I see that optimized in a form of community that integrates market principles, moral habits, and a commercial society. Those who talk about the means of markets as the end miss the point and subject themselves to losing a debate with Oren Cass. I have no intention of doing either. What are the governing principles by which we ought to think of public policy as useful in economic activity, let alone economic outcomes? I'll suggest 5 quick points as a framework for rejecting a greater role for public policy in economic activity and at least allowing us those first principles by which we think about these issues. Number 1, the default position must be free men and free markets with the state's role limited to enforcing the rule of law. A complex and evolved economy has invited more and more intervention, yet the state's severe limitations in knowledge and in incentive scream for a limited role in policymaking to impact economic outcomes. Number 2, the economic law of trade-offs must be front and center in this debate, as economics fundamentally deals with the allocation of scarcity, of scarce resources used in the meeting of the needs of humanity. We do not have the luxury of calling for greater public policy without earnestly counting the cost. Sometimes we may deem the cost worthwhile, but any attempt to view public policy as immune from the law of trade-offs or some sort of free call option is naive at best and dishonest at worst. Number 3, the role of public policy should be to remove impediments to productive activity. A proactive role beyond that exceeds the legitimate function and capability of government. Number 4, when government is in a position to exert policy pertinent to economic activity, we must observe the law of subsidiarity. In other words, if the new right were calling for resurgent localism from townships and city councils, I may have beef, but I'd have less of it than this Pollyannish view of Washington, D.C. Number 5, price discovery is vital. Interventions impede price discovery. So what is wrong with Oren's call for a greater role of public policy? I'll suggest 5 quick things, starting with the most important one. Number 1, it doesn't work. The history of government programs and use of public policy to drive promised outcomes is demonstrably clear it doesn't work, filled with unintended consequences, as their lack of knowledge and alignment of incentive creates a no skin in the game, corruption, grift, incompetence, failure, and a breakdown of public trust. Number 2, cronyism and rent-seeking run amok. This ought to be where I spend most of my time tonight. It's the real byproduct of greater public policy. It's really what we're debating tonight. The government picking winners and losers. Number 3, a lack of accountability and a misdiagnosis of problems. This is where I think Oren and I have a chance to find the most common ground. What frustrates me the most about the new right's concerns is that what they're missing. They're missing the real culprits, an excessive government spending, excessive government indebtedness, and a Federal Reserve run amok that is impeding economic growth through misallocation of resources. Number 4, mission creep. The policymakers are not trustworthy. I have 15 seconds left, so I have to skip quickly to number 5. The entire pretense of a national emergency calling for Washingtonian interventions of policy to free markets towards better aims ignores and excuses the greatest cause of our malaise, that which is neither caused by public policy or able to be solved by public policy, and that is a cultural epidemic of irresponsibility. of poor work ethic, of inadequate labor dynamism, of societal despair, of disdain for religion and church, of character, morality, and goodness, of the actual institutions that can generate progress in our economic life without the incalculable cost of cronyism and resource misallocation that a greater use of the state fully guarantees. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Great. Okay, we'll now have 5-minute rebuttals from each of the speakers.
Well, David went over his 7 minutes by a good 10 seconds, so I think he loses, and we move on to the reception. I believe we agreed. But for those who want to stick around, I will focus on a couple of things. I think the first is not a matter of David and I talking past each other, but taking, I think, very different approaches to how we analyze the situation. My feeling is that David's set of arguments takes for granted that markets will do the things we want, and therefore the question is how to get out of the way. It's not clear to me where that comes from as an analytical matter. That strikes me more as a belief than an actual argument. And I think empirically, we see that it's not necessarily true. I guess I would want to offer an analogy that I think is very useful for conservatives in particular, which is between markets and democracy. Right? If there are two things we're all for here in this room, it's markets and democracy. But we all know that when we say democracy, we don't actually mean democracy. Right? No one here thinks, well, we're for democracy, so we should just have a, plebiscite on every question every day. We understand that democracy is actually shorthand for a very complex system buttressed by institutions and constraints. We recognize the need for splitting power between the federal and the state and local. We recognize the need for 3 branches, for checks and balances, for anti-majoritarian forces, for a constitution. And when we forget that, as we have over time, for instance, believing that overthrowing a foreign government and placing ballot boxes out in the street, which frankly is not very much an exaggeration of the plan that we had in certain Middle Eastern countries, it does not work. I think we've done something similar on markets. When we say we believe in markets, it doesn't simply mean free men transacting. We value free men transacting, but for that to work, for it to actually be consistent with the thing that we know works, we have to remember all of the constraints, all of the institutions that go into making it work well. And so I just reject, purely as a philosophical matter, working from first principles, the idea that conservatives anywhere can or should have faith that simply leaving free people to transact will generate any of the things that we want them to. I'm not aware of any economic principle or evidence that that's true. And then conversely, I want to emphasize that the idea that we know that when government gets involved that doesn't work or makes things worse is likewise untrue. Until quite recently, it was actually the conservative position to have quite robust national economic policy. The GOP was the protectionist party. Right, going all the way back to Alexander Hamilton and his report on manufacturers, it was recognized that the US economy required a strong industrial policy. The American system, created by Henry Clay, was based on some of the world's highest tariffs, massive public investments in infrastructure, and a central federal role in the financial system. Abraham Lincoln was a tariff man. Teddy Roosevelt was a tariff man. You go all the way through. The kinds of investments that we recognize that we needed to make to foster virtually every industry that's been successful in this country, including the digital economy, traces repeatedly back to not just public dollars being flung around, but a variety of institutions and constraints. I like to cite the example of Ronald Reagan. Cato called Reagan the worst protectionist since Hoover. I think a wonderful example of a policy that Reagan pursued was imposing a quota on the import. Well, technically he negotiated with the Japanese, a quota on the import of Japanese vehicles. Not even a tariff, an outright, thou shalt not increase the import of Japanese vehicles. Now, what was the effect of that? Was it any of the things David described? No, it was the Japanese making massive capital investments in the United States, first in assembly plants. Where you get the investment in assembly plants, soon you get entire supply chains. After that, you get an R&D. We got the entire industry that developed in the US South, long after the quotas were gone, was a function of recognizing that making things matters, that where investment happens matters, and that markets won't necessarily cause it to happen where it is most beneficial to the national interest. Policymakers could do a fine job with that. And so we can get into plenty of examples, but I think it's really important to analyze this problem from the perspective of how we have actually seen markets operate and succeed, and not through the abstract principles that are not actually consistent with our experience.
Thank you, Oren. David?
Oren, do you want the extra 4 seconds?
I went over 2, so we're even now.
We're even up. Oren makes an important point that requires me to clarify the view that I hold about markets. The view that markets will create these desirable outcomes is not only not true, it is also not the point. The point we're debating tonight is whether or not the conditions we want for desirable outcomes in markets are better facilitated with greater policymaking or not. I do not hold to the Randian view or hyper-libertarian view or the Gordon Gekko view that atomistic actors will all go freely transact and create the common good. My view of markets is necessarily, not supplementally, necessarily tethered to mediating institutions. I believe the character formation that is necessary for free men to conduct freely in markets and do transactions that represent an economic good and a social good that we would be proud of, not only can't come from the state, but can only come from the non-state institutions, primarily family, church, synagogue, things of that nature. Mediating institutions in society that are vital to thriving markets. But I believe that we've put a burden on markets that is outside what vocabulary would allow. Markets are humans acting. And if all we are talking about is humans in their own imperfect condition, freely transacting, devoid of moral formation, character formation, then we have ourselves a problem. Now, today, the question is, in this environment, will we impede the cause of progress in the outcomes markets create with greater public policy? And Oren was helpful to use a few different examples. And I want to use an example that is a real cause du jour of the nationalist and protectionist and those that favor a greater role of public policy. What do we expect if the state plays a bigger role? And it's the CHIPS Act that passed under the Biden administration. I freely accept the prima facie appeal of some attempt to incentivize greater semiconductor manufacturing in the United States. And certainly various national security advantages can come in diversifying our sources of these things. But if you have a hard time swallowing the pill, as I do, of massive corporate welfare to Intel and Taiwan Semiconductor, two companies who I want to point out, their combined net profits in the last 3 years are over $100 billion. The idea of giving them government subsidies to resource domestic manufacturing, if so far you're okay with that, that's fine, but I just want to point out where we get in terms of outcomes, with what institutions we want to trust to couple market activity to with the state. The increase of public policy to impact economic ends creates a large and insurmountable chasm between technocratic rhetoric and implementation reality. Apparently, domestic construction and U.S. semiconductor output was so important to our well-being that it required $50 billion of taxpayer money being given to multi-billion-dollar companies whose net profits exceed that of most states, the GDP of most states. Yet apparently it wasn't that important. that the program was dismissed if companies did not provide an equity strategy discussing the specific steps they'd take to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, attract economically disadvantaged individuals, make commitments to build affordable housing, provide a supplier diversity plan, mandating coordination with minority-owned, veteran-owned, women-owned businesses. If you thought the end run here was economic activity and are a little distraught to see the hijacking of the bill by diversity czars who have already taken over higher education, at least take comfort in the fact that the climate czars got their teeth in it too. The CHIPS Act now requires a climate and environmental responsibility plan, a legal commitment to use renewable energy to maximum extent possible, and description of strategies for minimizing the potential for adverse impacts to local community, environmental justice concerns, et cetera. I'm quoting entirely from the regulations. This is what I believe we tethered ourselves to with greater public policy. So the fact of the matter is that Oren and I want the same thing of markets that work for the common good. I believe that the local institutions of community, family, church, tethered to markets help create that. And I do not believe for a second that the federal government or the CHIPS Act will. And I think that's the heart of our disagreement tonight.
Thank you very much, David. Lots of interesting first principles put out on the table so far. And I want to begin with two general questions. One is to ask about certain kinds of limit principles from both of the speakers. Oren, you want a larger role for government. Let's start with a factual question. Is this larger relative to the status quo? Does the status quo, are you thinking of that in terms of the CHIP Act, or what is it exactly that you think we need to go beyond right now?
So I think larger than the status quo is the right way to think about it. I should say that it is net larger. That is, I think there are certainly things the government does today that make no sense and are in fact impediments. And so thinking about, for instance, permitting requirements, there are plenty of things we could also reduce. And so this is not simply everything plus. But I think the kinds of things that we need a more substantial role in when we think about actually managing our borders, for instance, taking a point of view on the flow of investment to different sectors. It would be disingenuous for me to claim the agenda is somehow on net less. I think on net it absolutely needs to be more to address the problems that we have.
Is the CHIPS Act a good example of what government should be doing? Because this is somewhere.
Yes, yeah. So I'm glad David brought the CHIPS Act because I think it's a very good way to make it concrete. And I would say two things about, one thing about each of David's two main criticisms. The point that Intel and TSMC are massively profitable companies is entirely correct, and in my mind speaks exactly to the core of my argument, which is that they are massively profitable in ways that do not meet the common good that we are seeking to achieve in the United States. Intel realized, and many semiconductor companies realized, they could be more profitable designing here and manufacturing elsewhere. And by the way, it's not because Taiwan is, it's not because rocky outcroppings in the Pacific have a comparative advantage in semiconductor fabrication. It's because they had public policy that made it vastly cheaper through massive subsidies to build the fabrication facilities there. And so the reason we are giving money to these extremely profitable companies is not to bail them out. It's not because they're not profitable enough. It's because we want to create incentives for them to do something that the market does not create an incentive for them to do. This is exactly the heart of the problem. And so I think I found it very funny that it was both the Wall Street Journal editorial board and Bernie Sanders who were against the CHIPS Act on this basis, where in my mind it is entirely beside the point. I think David's point about the ways the CHIPS Act is being misused is entirely correct. It's something I'm certainly very frustrated about as well. They put in a child care mandate, which is a whole other ball of wax. But none of that strikes me as an argument against doing the CHIPS Act. And what I mean by that is two things. First, complaining about the parts of something that you don't like says nothing about the net benefit of it. That is, if we want to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to the US. And the cost of that is a bunch of obnoxious DEI statements. No, that's not my ideal. But if the choices you're presenting with me are this or nothing, this strikes me as massively better. And the second thing I would say about it that is to some extent a generalization of this point. J.D. Vance makes this point very well. If that's going to be your criticism, well, then we need to get rid of the Department of Defense as well, right? When the Biden administration is doing this everywhere. They're doing these things in the military. No sane person says, well, that's it. Then obviously the military makes no sense. Your choices are always second best. You evaluate net benefits at the margin. And you recognize that this is why winning elections matters. And that absolutely, I think a Republican administration could do it better than a Democratic administration does. But I don't think it's an argument against doing it.
Okay, David?
I just want to be clear that it is just fundamentally false that Intel and Taiwan Semiconductor did not have market incentives to move manufacturing to the United States. The reason I know that is they both were doing it to the tune of $72 billion of domestic investment before they passed the largest corporate welfare bill in American history. The stock of Intel was down from 50 to 30 because of the largest amount of capex they'd ever spent to go into Arizona and Ohio with a $20 billion investment to rebuild and re-onshore these investments. The market doesn't produce incentives for Intel and Taiwan to do so, so the government had to. I'm sorry, but this is wildly profitable activity, wildly profitable that the government is paying them to do. And along with I think that Oren's exactly right, that if something is fundamentally a good idea and they attach some bad things to it, that doesn't make the good idea net negative. But I want to ask anyone in this room, do you really believe that the CHIPS Act with child care mandates, DEI, ESG, on and on, I don't want to relitigate my list, do you believe those things are the exception or the rule? By inviting greater public policy making into market activity. I think the most important thing in response to Oren's point about markets and the burden that we put on them here is that we are dealing with a very advanced market economy, and that when he says the market isn't producing those incentives, I think we have to go back to remembering what it is markets are. That humans act with a certain degree of reason and rationality, and that there is a very important function for the state to punish lawbreakers. But that when you talk about an activity that is fundamentally unprofitable, humans do not continue to do it. And when you find an activity that is fundamentally profitable, humans find a way to do it and do it better. What the state is doing with this greater role of policymaking is impeding that process. They are putting up boundaries to not only price discovery and economic calculation, but rational acting from people that would very much, I know Intel would have domesticized their production because they were doing it years before CHIPS Act was presented. And so I guess we're doing one question at a time here, so I'll wait to come back to financialization.
I'll let you respond in the context of this question, but we talked about the CHIPS Act. Is there any kind of limit principle to exactly how many CHIPS Acts and other government public policy things we do, in your position,
Yeah, absolutely. I think, limiting principle in sort of the abstract sense, I tend to find very unsatisfying. I think it is inherently the role of statesmen and policymakers to make fact-specific judgments. And so the idea that we're going to have, some within the constitutional constraints and so forth, clear bright line, I think is implausible. I think we have to take all of the public choice concerns, all of the cronyism concerns that David has raised very seriously, and that argues for figuring out how to do these things well. In that respect as well, I think the CHIPS Act is far from ideal. I would much rather have us create essentially what's called something like a development bank. Ironically, this is something the U.S. has helped set up in many other parts of the world, but we do not have one ourselves. And the basic premise is you create a financial institution with a layer of public equity at the bottom that makes the raising of private capital effectively subsidized, that you can then use to support investments of national priority, whether that is in semiconductors, whether that is in critical mineral processing plants, whether that is in batteries. Now, David, I'm sure, would say, I'll let him say it himself, I would acknowledge that that's going to have problems too. But again, in my mind, the question isn't what is some perfect that we're going to achieve. The question is, can we do better than we are doing? And that's where, for me, David's points about something like semiconductors rings very false. Empirically, our share of semiconductor manufacturing was collapsing for years. The fact that it is an extremely profitable activity isn't what determines whether it gets invested in here. The question is, where is it the most profitable activity? It's literally 50% more expensive to build a fab here than an equivalent fab in Taiwan. So it doesn't matter that it would be profitable to do it here. It is more profitable to do it there. That is what is going to shape the investment environment. And again, it is not because of some underlying economic force. It is because of existing public policies. Intel had fallen 2 generations behind the cutting edge of semiconductor fabrication. And the exact timeline of when TSMC and Intel started making the commitments here, whether it was technically before or after Trump twisted whose arm, what they did in anticipation of CHIPS Act or not, we could bore everyone with a very long fact-specific debate about. I don't think anyone would dispute that we were on a very long downward trajectory until policymakers said this is actually going to be a priority and we are going to put weight behind it, and now we are on an upward trajectory. And if some DEI statements are the price of that, I'm not willing to concede that that is not a significant net gain for the United States.
Yeah, we have a development bank that is funded with public equity and then has risk-taking, and it's called every bank out there that is engaged in investment bank activity. But the unique part of that model would be risk takers that could lose their equity. So any government intervention that keeps risk takers from losing equity, I'd oppose. And any model that seeks to socialize the distribution of those profits, I'd oppose. On the basis of a first principle, that Oren's idea, I honestly believe, cannot be done apart from cronyism. You inherently encourage rent-seeking with the notion of these public-private partnerships. But I would like to ask a question, because Oren's point is exactly what I believe about what we ought to be asking. What's the best way to do it? And if I thought the CHIPS Act was the best way to get really robust technology, national security, job creation around semiconductors, and we had to deal with some obnoxious ESG or DEI or these other issues on the culture side, perhaps I could say the words that I found it tolerable, but I don't think I could. But here's the truth. Intel began moving these jobs at a 35% corporate income tax. Intel began moving these jobs with no expensing for R&D or amortized over a long period of time. What we're doing now is saying it's better to give this company and this company, it'd be less than 10 companies, the benefit from particular corporate welfare, the government picking of winners and losers, where I believe that those of us who advocate for free markets in a context that is consistent in the Burkean and American tradition could solve all of this with lower tax rates, lower regulatory burden, not applied to Intel, but applied to you and you and you and you and everybody. An equal administration of the law. I do think sometimes it's funny when the Wall Street Journal or Bernie Sanders are on the same side. I found myself in a similar position on Fox when I was opposed to states giving subsidies to Amazon for their beauty contest to go move their location there, and the only person that they could find that was in agreement with them was AOC and me. That's never going to happen again. But in this case, as Oren knows, the Wall Street Journal and Bernie Sanders were in agreement for different reasons. Me and AOC were in agreement for different reasons. I believe that what we're after to produce, I want the government to remove impediments. They created impediment after impediment after impediment to these companies that then moved activities offshore. And I believe that to now pay them to come back is outrageous.
What are the impediments you're referring to?
Just for sake of time and simplicity, generally the lowest hanging fruit is the tax burden and the regulatory burden. A regulatory burden that out of a greater role of public policy is intensified. It is not a sprinkling of conditions that if we go this route, we're going to get a little ESG and DEI thrown in. It is inherent. This is what we are signing up for by asking the government to play this larger role. The federal government at that. But when Oren said that in history, there were moments in which there were child labor laws, antitrust violations, and he said the New Deal, and I was hoping he'd say that was one of the ones that's an exception that proves my rule, but we didn't really go there. But we're talking about moments in which we say it argues for certain government interventions. I'm sorry, but a company that makes over $100 billion being paid to make manufacturing in Arizona that they're already making in Arizona anyways does not exactly rise to the level of child labor laws.
What would you respond to Oren's contention that in fact there was movement among these companies to actually get things done in the United States? There was that incentive, that the incentive was working, you know.
That the incentive is working to have this activity in the United States?
Yeah, basically, his argument was that there was a collapse of the semiconductor industry.
Right.
And presumably, are you arguing that, well, it's kind of time lag question because it was bouncing back, but it just hadn't bounced back yet? Or?
No, and I do think that there's a possibility of Oren and I having some common ground on some of this. I think that the problem, like so many things in this current debate, is that there's a lot of nuance. I think what happened with Intel's outsourcing was different than what happened with some other companies, and I fundamentally reject the notion that any activity taking place outside of our country is outside the best interest of the United States. But even apart from my stubborn insistence on the law of comparative advantage, in the particular case of Intel, those issues that were unique in that moment of semiconductors moving outside the United States, none of those things would have happened in a land in which the government's role in tax and regulation was more humble.
Okay, let me move on to some audience questions.
I'd say one just quick thing.
Please go ahead, Oren.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up briefly. What we really need is a tax cut point, I think, is so strange to me because we go through all the reasons DC doesn't work, crony this, it's going to be captured by these people, it's going to be an industry handout to this, and conservatives run through this entire litany and then say that's why we need tax reform. Right? Somehow it's okay that we're going to do a massive government bill that is more susceptible to rent seeking and industry capture than anything else you can imagine, but because it has the word tax at the start of it, all of a sudden now we have to be for it. And the reality is the Bush tax cuts of 2001, 2003 were supposed to accomplish this, did not. There's a wonderful Mercatus paper saying, well, the problem is the Bush tax cuts didn't do it right. It's like one of these tax cuts have never been tried things. We come back around with now we have to TICJA. TICJA is going to be the one that truly gets it right. Massive bill. Everything the White House went over about the next year claiming success turned out just not to be true about it. And I would just like us to be consistent in our confidence in Congress's ability to accomplish tax reform versus anything else. I think both will be messes. I'm very frustrated by the view that other things will be messes, but tax reform we can do.
But I do not say that tax reform we've done perfectly, and I did not say that the entire policy resolution comes down to lower tax cuts. I made the point that is conveniently ignored, that when Intel pulled out manufacturing of semiconductors in 1998, they were paying 35% corporate income rate. The 2001 and 2003 Bush tax cuts didn't touch business income taxes. They didn't touch them. Now, I do believe that a broad reduction of burden of business tax would be very good for American workers. I do believe a broad reduction of regulatory burden would be very good for American workers. But I'm not speaking right now to a specific tax bill. And of course, there's no, I think you might be accidentally making my point. The reduction from 35 to 21 came in 2017, enacted in 18. Intel announced plans to be pulling Arizona in 2019. So all I'm saying as a matter of historical fact is that at the point at which Intel did it, we can decide, was it a more favorable condition in Taiwan or was it a 35% tax rate? Because those were the facts on the ground at that time. But if we want a straw man that says, all conservatives want to do is come down to lower tax burden. I'm not suggesting that Congress can get tax rates perfect, because I don't think Congress can get the funding of government perfect, the size of government. What I'm suggesting, Oren, is that the starting point for where policy is relevant is in removing of impediments, and what greater impediment is there than the toll that government takes.
Good brief response, if you want. Good. Okay, let me move to the audience questions then. And I'm presuming this is directed to Oren, but both can handle. How do you handle the systemic corruption with government policy choosing who the winner is?
Well, I think it depends, first of all, on the kind of policy you're doing. So one of the reasons I favor fairly broader and blunter interventions is because they avoid that problem. So for instance, rather than try to go, as I was saying, industry by industry, have a broader financing mechanism. Rather than try to figure out what should be made here versus elsewhere, use a tariff. Rather than try to figure out industry by industry, Nikki Haley had this strange quote yesterday, we need to go to industry and ask them what workers they need and bring in those workers. Just enforce the border. Restrict how many particularly lower wage workers can come into the country. And so in my mind, the goal is precisely to be taking an approach that does not pick, this is where we're going to send the money to, that's what we're going to send the money to, but rather to put in place the constraints and the incentives so that markets actually work better, so that free markets, that people acting in the market choose to do the kinds of things that are both efficient and productive, but also better aligned with the common good.
So disappointed, because he said we need to protect the border, and I wrote amen on my paper, and I thought, here we are, we're getting this common ground, and then his next sentence, we have to restrict lower wage workers that come into the country. I want to protect the border, I want everyone coming in legally, but I want to point out that every single lower wage worker who comes in is a lower wage consumer. This is economics 101. You do not get a consumer a producer that comes in this country that is not also creating more demand. And so this is not true that our problem on the immigration side is the existence of lower income workers. It's the welfare state. In other words, greater public policy. All we have to do is protect the border, enforce the laws we have on hand, and not give people money not to work. But the notion that the mere existence of lower wage workers is hurting those that are lower skilled and looking for entry in the workforce, that lacks any limiting principle. Every lower wage worker affects every worker. The whole entire issue in a market economy is competition, is doing better, working harder, using those various elements that would enable you to stay gainfully employed in the society. So I guess you're doing Q&A, so I don't want to keep bouncing with my own rebuttals, but.
Okay, this is directed to David. What can the government do to incentivize or promote the greater role of now diminishing church or other such value-instilling institutions, which you emphasized in your presentation? Maybe the question should be, can the government?
This has become a very interesting subject, particularly for people of faith like myself, about what the role of government is supposed to be in the exercise of religion. And I do confess to having a general, classically liberal approach to the subject, that I think the most important thing in our nation and its history and heritage that the government could do was not mandate the particular practice of a given religion. But I do not believe that ever meant or should mean now the state divorcing itself from principles, from morality, from a code of ethics. There is a role in which the government has, but do I believe that my primary agenda would be for the government to be supporting greater role of church? I not only don't believe that, but if I did, it would be utterly worthless and futile. What can the government do besides use coercion? What is their value proposition? A monopoly on violence. That's what the government can do. The government can force people to go to church. That's not what we're after. I believe that these things are inevitably divorced from government in terms of the low-hanging fruit of advancing the common good in society, that we require more wholesome families. Now, on the margin, are there policy-related things that I think are worthy of discussion about marriage penalty taxes and things like that? I'm open to all sorts of those types of conversations. I don't happen to believe that our primary issue with how many kids people have in a nuclear family is related to the tax code. But on the margin, there may be things they can do. But my answer is the same I said in my opening speech tonight. The number one thing they can do is remove impediments. You know, like don't shut the country down and tell people they can't go to church for a year. Things like that, for example.
I think we agree on that. Can I pick up on the immigration point briefly? Because I think it's a broader one. So what David described is simply not economics 101. It is true that workers are also consumers, but workers in one segment of the labor market consume across the economy. So it's actually the Cato Institute's Immigration Symposium has a wonderful piece by an economist named Ethan Lewis. It's 2 myths and 1 truth about immigration. And what he emphasizes the one truth is that the relative number of workers of a given skill set in a given segment of the labor market is highly relevant to outcomes. So when you have relatively more lower skilled workers coming in, you add relatively more to that segment of the labor market relative to demand for the labor in that segment. So I'm all for bringing in relatively more higher skilled workers. I think that would also be very good for low skilled workers. But saying that this is the way the market works and competition is good and we should therefore welcome large numbers of low-skilled workers and that will be good for the low-skilled workers are here. It's, again, this isn't where actually following all the way back to Adam Smith's intuition about how markets work and how capitalism will succeed takes us. In fact, if we want capitalism to succeed, we need to create pressure on capital to do more with the workers they have. The safety valve of here's ever more low-skilled workers relieves them of the pressure to raise wages, relieves them of the pressure to find productivity gains. There's a reason it is the number one item on the corporate lobby agenda. And by the way, there's a reason both parties were saying, well, if we really want to get inflation under control, let's bring in lots more low-skilled workers, because it does not have the same effect on the demand side and the supply side. And so in my mind, this is a perfect example of a place where no, government won't get it exactly right, but government playing a firm role in saying who is allowed to enter the country and participate in our nation's labor market is fundamental to the outcomes that we get and the common good. It's absolutely a place I think there's room for incredible improvement and a much stronger role than the government plays today.
So Oren makes a good point that the government could have a role in determining who comes in the country, and the broader point here about a greater role of public policy. So they've done that. They decided to create a $20 minimum wage in California for fast food workers, which was largely positions being taken by undocumented immigrants before. So what is the net result of that? These companies are going to spend half of the money on labor that they spent previously with a $20 wage than they did with a $7, $9, $11 wage. How's that possible? The government, through public policy and unintended consequence, and the classic government misallocation of resource using policy, gave the largest incentive in history for them to go technologize those jobs and utilize kiosks that would remove the need altogether. Well, the fact of the matter is that, of course, it is true that it is not a one-for-one match person by person on consumption and production for workers. My point is that it is not zero-sum, that when a worker comes in lower wage, that results in that entire opportunity set being taken from another American worker. It simply doesn't. But the bigger issue to me is that we continue to use a problem to solve with the government problem that creates another problem that requires more and more treatment. Right now, the unintended consequence of these obnoxious minimum wage laws that are unemploying low-skilled workers. So I think that it speaks, we're in the weeds on some of the particulars, and there's room for disagreement on these applications. But as a matter of core principle, I want to point out this is a classic case of the government creating a problem and then telling us what the solution has to be for them to fix the problem they created.
David, let me ask a more general question. It seems to me it's pretty clear that markets act efficiently in a way that distributes benefits differently. You know, there's people who are smart and take initiative and do things well, get rewarded in the market. And if you are working in an industry where the people you're working for are not quite so sharp, you're going to get caught up in the creative destruction of the market. It seems to me that the whole question behind a lot of what we're talking about is precisely how do we deal with the creative destruction of the market? Because we want creative destruction in a way. That is, we want to have a shifting of resources from something that's not very efficient and to areas where it is efficient. But it means that some people are going to get hurt by that, and a lot of people aren't very adaptable. And I'm thinking especially of lower skilled blue collar workers. Yeah. So how do we deal, I mean, if you're a proponent of the market and less interested in government intervention, how do we deal with the people who, in a way, are caught up, and harmed by this creative destruction in the market?
There's a little difference in Oren's concern with CHIPS Act is it's fundamentally a good idea, but there's this stuff I agree I don't like, but we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think it's theoretically a fair point. I am not saying that overall markets are better arbiters of risk and reward and better allocators of resources. And yes, they're going to hurt more people, but overall net, that's worth it. I'm not suggesting that it's a net benefit. I'm suggesting that the alternative makes it worse. The creative destruction and the pain it does to people individually is worsened by attempting to use public policy to soften. What we have right now, through a 50-year period of globalization, a 50-year period of digitization, and the greatest number of people ever working, and a lot of issues I have with the labor force that I'm convinced are entirely cultural. And I can empirically demonstrate that. I do have a new book coming out in February, Full-Time Work and the Meaning of Life, where I quote my friend Oren in the book a couple times favorably. But I don't quote him unfavorably. But this notion that we start with a constrained vision of society, as Thomas Sowell taught us. I do not believe that markets or the state can smooth out all the imperfections of dynamic life, that there are going to be issues that will come up. And you stated something that I'm not sure Oren would say he agrees with, but I'm positive some of his friends would not, which is that we all want this creative destruction. I don't think it's true that we all want it. I think that there are more and more who are saying all of these advancements, they're just not worth it. And that, to me, is a huge problem. What I'm advocating for by a lower role of public policy and a greater role of market dynamism is truth-telling. That you cannot sleep in your mom's basement till you're 34 years old, playing video games, doing drugs, and blame China that you lost your job. That's what I'm advocating for.
The Kevin Williamson argument. Yeah. Brief response?
Yeah, I guess I certainly agree with David that we have a lot of cultural problems. The reason the one statistic I've mentioned is this concept of secure jobs is because I do think we have to acknowledge that it's not as if the economy is just generating all these great jobs that we can't find anyone to fill. Our economy is badly struggling, I think, to create the kinds of jobs we would say that we aspire to have available for everybody. And the second statistic that I will throw out here that I think gets to the heart of a lot of this and to the creative destruction point, certainly growth and productivity growth have slowed in this country in recent decades. Manufacturing productivity has been negative in the last decade. According to the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you need more labor in a factory to produce the same things that you produced 10 years ago. Now that should be impossible in a capitalist system that is functioning at all well. And to me, it speaks to what is the real problem with what's going on with creative destruction, which is not the creative destruction. Creative destruction can be wonderful if it is one half of a cycle that is also creating new and better things. You go all the way back to the mechanization of agriculture, the sort of quintessential example. Well, obviously we don't want to, all still be working on farms. Absolutely true, except if we had mechanized agriculture and not created new, better than on-the-farm jobs as part of the transformation that was going on, we'd said, well, 2% of the people are now going to be highly productive farm workers, and everyone else is going to sit at home. Then I think we, in fact, would have every reason to be concerned about the mechanization of agriculture. What we are not seeing happen in the economy today and in recent decades is the channeling of investment into creating new and better opportunities for the typical worker to be more productive. And it goes in part to that low-wage labor point. It goes in part to the fact that, well, we can just offshore it. It goes in part to the, well, we can just bring in more low-wage people to do it. Because when I hear David's story about the automation of the fast food terminals, I say, amazing. That's fantastic. If what we did have was a whole bunch of illegal immigrants flooding the low-wage market in California, leading to a model where fast food industry could just pay people terrible wages, no reason to make capital investment in productivity. And we said, actually, there's another world where we significantly reduce the size of the low-wage labor force. There are major incentives for the fast food companies to make capital investments. And the end result is a smaller number of way more productive, higher-paying jobs in that industry. That's exactly the formula we're looking for. That is exactly what generated American prosperity for the first 2 centuries, and that what we have totally failed to do over the last 40 or 50 years, because there have been no constraints making that the thing that generates profit.
Oren, does it concern you, teenage unemployment, 16 to 19-year-olds that don't need to support a family?
Oh, absolutely.
So who do you think is really the person with the fast food jobs that is priced out now? Do you really think it's people with families, or do you think it's teenagers like me who right now run a $5 billion wealth firm, but when I was 16 years old worked at Carl's Jr.?
Well, first of all, I would say that's a totally different argument than this was a bunch of illegal immigrants in California.
What I'm saying is you're saying that legal immigrants have lost the job and now people with families will get them. What I'm saying is what this policy milieu has created is absolute dynamic of no jobs for people 16 to 19 years old. We have basically said teenagers don't need to establish a work ethic anymore, and I think we've done it out of a straw man that those jobs were meant to be for people with families, where they were really meant to be teenage entry-level jobs.
I really hate to cut off an interesting discussion, forgive me, but
Carl's Jr. always gets me a little excited.
we need to move on to a quick summary, 2 to 3 minutes. Oren, you want to begin? Or?
Sure. Thank you, David. I think there's been a terrific discussion, and I commend the podcasts that he hosted me on, all of his podcasts, but mostly with me as guest. Yes. But he does a wonderful job, and they many more hours of exactly this if you need even more. I think it's an incredible discussion, and I think it ultimately reflects exactly what is going on within the right of center writ large right now in the debate over the future of conservative economic policy. One thing I would take issue with is the idea that what David is presenting represents the traditional conservative view. Until recently, the conservative economic view, I think, would have rightly recognized that markets are a wonderful tool, but they are very limited in what they actually do well, that many of the things that we aspire to are not things we can expect them to deliver, and that government is going to have to play a significant role, not in the big government sense of raising and spending lots of money, but in the sense of establishing the rules of the road within which the market operates. And so I would argue that that is actually the traditionally conservative view, one that was overtaken in really the Reagan era by a much more economically libertarian view that said simply, we are going to get government out of the way. at a moment in time at the end of stagflation when that was absolutely necessary. But that has somehow hardened into this view that, well, what's conservative economic policy? Oh, it's tax cuts and free trade and deregulation. And there's absolutely nothing conservative about believing that tax cut is the needed thing, regardless of what else is going on in the world. The facts that we needed tax cuts when the top individual rate was 70%, when the corporate rate was 50%, when the capital gains rate was 45%, should not lead us to believe that if you're a conservative, you believe what we need is a tax cut when the rates are the rates that we've had in the 21st century. And so it seems to me that the heart of the conservative ethos, and one that I am very excited to see is being recovered by a lot of conservative thinkers, writers, politicians, is one that recognizes that the market truly is a means to an end. And if we want it to succeed, and if we want to win the argument against those who would simply argue that we need government to do things, then we actually have to do an awful lot of work, given from where we are right now. And so to some extent, the ultimate of the second bests that I think we have to think about is whether we are going to actually address the problems that this country has in a way that does leave markets in control, or whether we're going to continue with the sort of rhetoric that was interesting in 1980, expiring in 1990, totally out of date by 2000, and now failing to garner much support at all, and simply abandon the field to the progressive view. Okay. And my view is that conservatism needs to take a much stronger role going forward.
Thank you, Oren. Your summary, the end here, David?
Oren started off his opening speech tonight with a profoundly important observation that policymakers must have a conception of the common good and human flourishing. I agree with Oren entirely. The policymakers that Oren wants to give more power to do not share our conceptions of the common good or human flourishing. And herein lies the rub, I think, of our debate, is that we are at some levels of agreement desiring common good, desiring a market economy that distributes opportunity equitably and gives this sort of opportunity society that we believe in a fair shake. The question becomes whether or not an increased role of Washington, D.C. helps or hurts that cause. And I firmly believe that the testimony of history is clear, that it hurts it. But Oren has brought up several times that there are issues out of the Reagan moment that worked to some degree at a time, but now have become antiquated. And it's a very common line of reasoning right now with some of the new right and greater flirtation with populism, nationalism, protectionism. But I want to come back to a point I made in my opening speech, which is where I believe there's the best opportunity for some of those on Oren's side who disagree with those on my side of this issue. The economy is badly struggling to create jobs. It's not really exactly true. There's 9.6 million job openings, but there is about 4 million people looking for a job. But Oren would say, and he'd be right, that it's the type of jobs that we're needing, that there may be a lot of unskilled open jobs. The CFO of Chevron said to my face, and I will never forget this moment, about 10 years ago, that they were going to pay people, low-skilled workers, $60,000 to get the training, get the licensing for a particular kind of welding that they needed. They were looking to hire in East Texas, Louisiana, 2,200 people. They could not get 1,000 people to pass a drug test. They had to bring in immigrant workers to fill in for these jobs that were ultimately going to pay $115,000 starting wage after they got this special certification. We have a cultural problem. And by hiding behind a policy solution in Washington, D.C., we're just delaying the inevitable. But let's say that we want to focus on the policy problem. What I want my friend Oren to understand is we have a real bad policy problem that's really impeded economic growth and productivity. It's called $32 trillion of national debt. We had $1 trillion when Reagan left office. We have $32 trillion now. We're running $2 trillion annual deficits. And we have Japanified our economy into economic stagnation with empty ability to use fiscal policy and monetary policy to affect economic growth. 15 years of 0% interest rates, $9 trillion of quantitative easing, and we didn't talk about monetary policy once tonight. the new right doesn't talk about monetary policy. They have a lot of the problems rightly identified, but what caused them and what will solve them, I think, is the area of our disagreement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Well, thank you both.
Thank you, guys. That was amazing. And I can, if the room is anything like me, I'll be thinking about this now deeply for several days, because I heard great arguments on both sides. We can go upstairs and have a drink and a snack. And I should say to those of you that are like me, there's a long stairway down here, but at the end of the hallway here, there are 2 elevators. Thank you all. It was terrific.